The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the downtown courthouse as attorney David Chen stood in the quiet corridor, his leather briefcase resting against the marble wall. At 34 years old, he had seen his fair share of difficult cases, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that something important was about to unfold. David adjusted his navy blue tie and took a deep breath. He'd been up since 5 in the morning, going over every detail of the case one more time. His client, a 22-year-old college student named Tommy Richardson, sat on a wooden bench nearby, his leg bouncing nervously. The young man's future hung in the balance, and David knew it. Tommy was a good kid. Honor student, volunteer at the local community center, never been in trouble with the law, not even a parking ticket. Yet here he was, facing serious charges of assaulting a police officer. The accusation alone could derail everything Tommy had worked for. His scholarship, his dreams of becoming a teacher, his entire life could vanish because of one traffic stop gone wrong. But David had something that changed everything. Evidence. Real, undeniable evidence. 3 months earlier, Tommy had been driving home from his evening shift at a grocery store. It was around 11 at night and he was tired, just wanting to get home and study for his midterm exam. That's when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any stop signs. He had no idea why he was being pulled over. The officer who stopped him was Derek Hartley, a 15-year veteran of the police force. From the moment Hartley approached the car, something felt off. Tommy had done everything right. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, spoke respectfully, handed over his license and registration when asked. But Hartley seemed agitated, almost looking for a reason to escalate things. The dash cam footage from Hartley's patrol car told the whole story. David had watched it dozens of times, and each time it made his blood boil. Tommy never raised his voice, never made any threatening movements. He simply asked why he'd been pulled over. That seemed to anger Hartley even more. In the video, you could hear Hartley's tone change. He became aggressive, demanding that Tommy step out of the vehicle. Tommy complied immediately. Then Hartley ordered him to turn around and place his hands on the car. Again, Tommy did exactly as he was told. But it wasn't enough. What happened next was captured in crystal clear detail. Hartley grabbed Tommy's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back. Tommy winced in pain but didn't resist. He kept saying, "I'm not resisting, sir. I'm not resisting." But Hartley claimed Tommy had tried to pull away, had become combative. That's when Hartley forced Tommy to the ground, pressing his knee into the young man's back while handcuffing him. The arrest report Hartley filed painted a completely different picture. According to his account, Tommy had been belligerent from the start, had refused to comply with orders, and had physically tried to fight back. Hartley claimed he feared for his safety and had to use necessary force to subdue a dangerous suspect. He charged Tommy with assault on an officer, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. But the dash cam didn't lie, and that's what David planned to show the court today. As David stood in that courthouse hallway, he thought about the journey that had brought him here. Growing up as the son of immigrants, he'd seen firsthand how the system could work against people who looked different or spoke with an accent. His parents had come to this country with nothing but hope and determination. They'd worked multiple jobs to put David and his sister through school, always telling them that education was the key to a better life. David had promised himself that he would use his education to help people, to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. That's why he became a lawyer, not for the money or the prestige, but to make a real difference. Over the past 8 years, David had built a solid reputation. Other attorneys respected him. Judges knew he came to court prepared. But more importantly, people in the community trusted him. They knew he genuinely cared about their cases, that he would fight for them with everything he had. This case with Tommy had landed on his desk through a referral from another attorney. The moment David saw the dashcam footage, he knew he had to take it. This wasn't just about defending one innocent young man. This was about exposing a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. David had done his homework on Officer Hartley. He'd submitted public records requests, interviewed witnesses from other cases, talked to community members. What he discovered was troubling. Hartley had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years. People had accused him of using excessive force, of targeting individuals based on their race, of falsifying reports. Yet somehow nothing ever stuck. Every complaint had been investigated internally and dismissed. Hartley always seemed to get the benefit of the doubt, but not this time. This time there was video evidence that couldn't be explained away or ignored. Judge Patricia Morrison would be presiding over today's hearing. David respected her greatly. She had a reputation for being fair but firm, someone who didn't tolerate nonsense from either side. She'd been on the bench for 2 decades and had seen everything. If anyone would look at the evidence objectively and do the right thing, it would be Judge Morrison. The courthouse was starting to fill up with people. Attorneys hurried past with their clients. Court staff moved efficiently through the hallways, and the familiar sounds of a busy judicial building echoed off the walls. David glanced at his watch. The hearing would start in 20 minutes. Tommy stood up and walked over, his face pale with worry. "Mr. Chen, what do you think is going to happen today?" His voice trembled slightly despite his effort to sound calm. David placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "We're going to show them the truth, Tommy, that's all we can do. But the truth is on our side. The video speaks for itself." Tommy nodded, trying to draw strength from his attorney's confidence. "I just keep thinking about what my mom said. She told me to always respect the police, to do whatever they say, and I'd be fine. I did everything right, Mr. Chen, I really did." "I know you did," David replied gently. "And that's exactly what we're going to prove in there." As they spoke, David noticed Officer Hartley entering the courthouse through the main entrance. Even from a distance, David could see the man's body language. Hartley walked with an air of arrogance, like someone who believed he was untouchable. He'd probably testified in court hundreds of times, watched his word be taken as gospel simply because of the badge he wore. But today would be different. David picked up his briefcase and gestured toward the courtroom doors. "Come on, Tommy, it's time to fight for your future." As they walked into the courtroom, David felt that familiar surge of determination. This was why he'd become a lawyer. This moment right here, standing beside someone who'd been wronged, ready to demand justice. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Challenging a police officer's credibility was always an uphill battle. But he had the truth on his side, and sometimes that's all you need. The courtroom had that distinct smell of old wood and floor polish that seemed to exist in every courthouse David had ever been in. The high ceilings and formal atmosphere usually made people speak in hushed tones, as if the very walls commanded respect. Judge Morrison's courtroom was already half full, with other attorneys waiting for their cases to be called, along with a few members of Tommy's family who had come to show support. David guided Tommy to the defense table and began arranging his materials. His laptop was ready to play the dashcam footage, printed copies of the video stills were organized in a folder, and his notes were highlighted and tabbed for easy reference. Years of practice had taught him that preparation was everything. You never wanted to fumble around looking for documents while a judge waited impatiently. As David settled into his seat, he felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. He glanced up and immediately locked eyes with Officer Hartley, who was sitting in the gallery section of the courtroom. The officer wasn't even trying to hide his hostility. His jaw was clenched tight, his arms crossed over his chest, and his eyes burned with an intensity that made David's instincts kick into high gear. This wasn't the first time David had faced down an angry officer in court. It came with the territory when you defended people accused of crimes against police. But something about Hartley's stare felt different. More personal, more dangerous. David broke eye contact first, not out of intimidation, but because he needed to focus on the task at hand. He couldn't let Hartley's theatrics distract him from what mattered, which was getting justice for Tommy. The bailiff called the court to order, and everyone stood as Judge Morrison entered through her chamber's door. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore her black robe with the kind of dignity that came from decades of service. David had appeared before her several times and always found her to be scrupulously fair. "Please be seated," Judge Morrison said as she took her place behind the bench. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the case file in front of her. "We're here today for a preliminary hearing in the matter of the state versus Thomas Richardson. Mr. Chen, you're representing the defendant?" David stood. "Yes, Your Honor. And the state is represented by Assistant District Attorney Wilson today." A middle-aged man in a gray suit stood up from the prosecution table. "Yes, Your Honor," Judge Morrison nodded. "Very well, Mr. Wilson, you may begin." The prosecutor went through the standard opening, outlining the charges against Tommy, and explaining that the state intended to prove that the defendant had assaulted Officer Hartley during a routine traffic stop. His presentation was textbook, nothing fancy, just hitting the basic points. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood and buttoned his suit jacket, a habit from his early days as a lawyer that he'd never quite shaken. Your Honor, the defense will show that these charges are completely without merit. My client did absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, we have video evidence that proves Officer Hartley's account of what happened that night is entirely fabricated. He could hear Hartley shift in his seat behind him. The word fabricated had hit its mark. David continued. We'll be presenting dashcam footage from Officer Hartley's own patrol car that shows my client complying with every single command given to him. The video will demonstrate that Officer Hartley used excessive force against an unarmed, cooperative young man who posed no threat whatsoever. Judge Morrison looked interested. You have the dashcam footage with you today? Yes, Your Honor. Ready to play whenever the court wishes to see it. Let's proceed then. I'd like to see this evidence. David moved to set up his laptop, connecting it to the courtroom's display system. As he worked, he could feel the tension in the room building. Tommy's mother clutched her husband's hand in the front row. The prosecutor looked somewhat concerned, which told David that maybe the state hadn't reviewed the footage as carefully as they should have. And Hartley. David didn't need to look back to know the officer was seething. The lights dimmed slightly as David began playing the video on the large screen. The timestamp showed it was 11:14 p.m. on the night in question. The dashcam had a clear view of Hartley's patrol car pulling up behind Tommy's older Honda Civic. You could see Tommy's car pull over immediately. No delay, no attempt to evade. David narrated as the video played.
Your Honor, as you can see, my client pulled over within seconds of seeing the patrol lights.
No traffic violations are visible on this footage. No speeding, no erratic driving. The video showed Hartley approaching the driver's side window. The audio was crystal clear. Tommy's voice came through, polite and respectful. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? Hartley's response was curt. License and registration. Yes, sir. My wallet is in my back pocket. Is it okay if I reach for it? Even Judge Morrison nodded slightly at that. Tommy was doing everything right, announcing his movements, being cooperative, but on the video you could see Hartley's body language change. He stepped back from the car suddenly, his hand moving toward his weapon. Get out of the car, now. Tommy's confusion was evident. Sir, did I do something wrong? I said get out of the car. The fear in Tommy's voice was heartbreaking. Okay. I'm getting out. Please don't shoot. David paused the video. Your Honor, at this point my client had done nothing to warrant this aggressive response. He was simply asking a reasonable question. He resumed playback. Tommy stepped out of the car slowly, his hands visible. Sir, can you please tell me why I was pulled over? That question seemed to infuriate Hartley. Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Yes, sir. Tommy complied immediately. What happened next was painful to watch. Hartley grabbed Tommy's arm and wrenched it behind his back with unnecessary force. Tommy cried out in pain. Ow, sir, that hurts. I'm not resisting. Stop pulling away from me, Hartley shouted, even though the video clearly showed Tommy standing still. Then Hartley swept Tommy's legs out from under him, sending the young man crashing to the pavement. Tommy's cry of pain echoed through the courtroom. Hartley pressed his knee into Tommy's back, grinding him into the ground while pulling his arms back to handcuff him. I can't breathe, Tommy gasped. Please, I can't breathe. Hartley ignored him, keeping his full weight on Tommy's, back for nearly a minute before finally pulling him to his feet and shoving him toward the patrol car. David stopped the video and let the silence hang in the courtroom for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled but filled with quiet outrage. Your Honor, this video shows exactly what happened that night. My client was polite, cooperative, and non-threatening. He did not assault Officer Hartley. He did not resist arrest. He did absolutely nothing to justify the use of force we just witnessed. Judge Morrison's face had grown increasingly stern as the video played. She looked down at the documents in front of her, then back up at David. And this is the complete, unedited footage? Yes, Your Honor. We can provide the original file with all metadata intact if needed. She turned her attention to the prosecutor. Mr. Wilson, have you seen this footage? The prosecutor stood, looking uncomfortable. We have reviewed the police report, Your Honor, but I'll admit that this is the first time I'm seeing the complete dashcam video. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. That was not the answer she wanted to hear. So you brought charges against this young man without reviewing all available evidence? Your Honor, we rely on the officer's reports. That's not what I asked you, Mr. Wilson. Her tone was sharp now. Did you or did you not review this video before filing charges? No, Your Honor. The judge looked back at David. Continue, Mr. Chen. David pulled out a thick folder. Your Honor, I'd also like to bring to the court's attention that Officer Hartley has been the subject of multiple complaints over his 15-year career. I've documented 23 separate incidents where citizens have accused him of using excessive force, falsifying reports, or engaging in discriminatory behavior. He could hear Hartley stand up abruptly in the gallery, but David kept his focus on the judge. Each of these complaints was filed through the proper channels, David continued, and each one was investigated by the department's Internal Affairs Division. Somehow, every single complaint was dismissed or resulted in nothing more than a brief retraining session. Judge Morrison held out her hand. I'd like to see those records. David walked forward and handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. As she began flipping through the pages, her frown deepened with each one she read. Behind David, he could hear Hartley whispering angrily to someone. The officer's frustration was becoming more obvious by the minute. David pressed forward. Your Honor, 18 of those 23 complaints involved people of color. The pattern is undeniable. Officer Hartley has a history of targeting specific communities, using excessive force and then filing false reports to justify his actions. This is ridiculous. Hartley's voice rang out from the gallery. Judge Morrison's head snapped up. Officer Hartley, you will remain silent in my courtroom or I will have you removed. But the damage was done. Hartley's outburst had revealed exactly what David had hoped to show, that the officer had a temper. David stepped into the courthouse hallway, pulling out his phone as he walked away from the courtroom doors. The marble floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the usual buzz of conversation filled the corridor as lawyers and clients huddled. In small groups discussing their cases, he found a quieter spot near a window overlooking the street, below, and dialed Tommy's mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice tight with anxiety. Mr. Chen, how is it going? Is Tommy okay? David smiled, genuinely happy to deliver good news for once. Mrs. Richardson, it's going very well. The judge saw the video and I think she understands exactly what happened that night. Tommy did nothing wrong and the evidence proves it. He could hear her exhale with relief and then she started crying softly. Thank God, we've been so worried. Tommy is such a good boy, Mr. Chen. He would never hurt anyone. I know that, Mrs. Richardson, and soon everyone else will know it too. I need to get back inside, but I wanted to update you. We should have more information after the judge makes her ruling. Thank you, Mr. Chen. Thank you so much for believing in my son. As David ended the call, he felt that familiar sense of purpose that reminded him why he loved his job. These moments when he could bring hope to a family that had been living in fear made all the long hours and difficult cases worthwhile. He was about to head back to the courtroom when he heard heavy footsteps behind him. David turned to see Officer Hartley walking toward him with purposeful strides. The officer's face was flushed red, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Every muscle in his body seemed tense with barely contained rage. David's instincts immediately went on alert. He'd dealt with angry people before, plenty of them, but something about the look in Hartley's eyes made him cautious. This wasn't just regular courtroom frustration. This was something deeper, more dangerous. Can I help you, officer? David kept his voice calm and professional, the same tone he'd use with any opposing party in a case. Hartley stopped about 3 feet away, invading David's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. You think you're so smart, don't you? His voice was low and threatening. Standing up there in your fancy suit with your fancy words making me look bad. David didn't step back. He'd learned a long time ago that showing fear only encouraged bullies. Officer Hartley, I'm not trying to make you look bad. I'm simply presenting the evidence. The video speaks for itself. The video? Hartley spat the words out like they tasted bitter. You don't know what it's like out there on the streets. You sit in your comfortable office and judge people like me who put our lives on the line every single day. I respect the difficult job that police officers do, David replied evenly. But that doesn't give anyone the right to abuse their authority or lie in official reports. Tommy Richardson did nothing wrong, and you know it. Hartley's face got even redder. A few other people in the hallway had started to notice the confrontation, turning to watch. An older attorney David recognized from other cases paused mid-conversation with his client, his expression concerned. That punk got exactly what he deserved, Hartley hissed, stepping even closer. People like him need to learn respect. Need to learn their place, and there it was. The mask had slipped completely. David felt a cold anger settle in his chest, but he kept his face neutral. People like him? What exactly do you mean by that, officer? Hartley sneered. You know exactly what I mean. You people come into our neighborhoods, into our country, and think you can just do whatever you want. Think you can disrespect the law and get away with it. David's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. Officer Hartley, I'm going to walk back into that courtroom now. I suggest you do the same and let the judge handle this case as she sees fit. He started to turn away, but Hartley grabbed his arm. I'm not done talking to you. Officer, remove your hand from my arm. David's voice was still controlled but firm. You're creating a scene in a courthouse, and there are witnesses watching. More people had definitely noticed now. A court clerk had stopped at the water fountain, her hand frozen on the button as she stared at them. 2 other lawyers had moved closer, clearly ready to intervene if needed. Hartley let go but moved to block David's path. You think you're better than me? Coming in here with your evidence and your arguments, trying to destroy my career. You have no idea who you're messing with. I'm not trying to destroy anyone's career, David said quietly. I'm trying to defend an innocent young man who was mistreated. If that threatens your career, maybe you should consider why. That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Hartley's anger, which had been simmering just below the surface, suddenly erupted. Don't you dare lecture me. I've been on the force for 15 years. I've put away real criminals, dangerous people. And now some uppity lawyer who thinks he knows everything is going to try to make me look like the bad guy? The racial undertones in his words were impossible to miss. David could feel the attention of everyone in the hallway now focused squarely on them. This had gone from a tense exchange to something much more serious. Officer Hartley, this conversation is over. I'm going back to the courtroom. David moved to step around him, but Hartley wasn't done. His voice got louder, drawing even more attention. You people are all the same. Coming to this country, taking our jobs, and then having the nerve to attack police officers when we're just trying to do our jobs. I was born in this country, David said calmly. But even if I wasn't, that wouldn't give you the right to speak to me this way. Now please, step aside. Hartley's breathing was heavy now, his chest heaving with rage. His face had gone from red to almost purple. You're making a big mistake going after me. A big mistake. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Are you threatening me, officer? David pulled out his phone. Because if you are, I should probably start recording this conversation. That seemed to push Hartley over the edge. Put that phone away. I have every right to record in a public space, especially when someone is making threatening statements toward me. A small crowd had gathered now. David recognized a few other attorneys, some court staff, and even a couple of people who appeared to be waiting for their own cases. Everyone seemed frozen, watching this confrontation unfold like a car crash they couldn't look away from. Hartley's voice rose to a shout. You think you're so much better than everyone else? You think your fancy degree and your expensive suit make you special? You're nothing. You and that punk kid you're defending are nothing. The racist implications were becoming more explicit with every word. David could see people in the crowd exchanging uncomfortable glances. Some pulled out their own phones, starting to record. Officer Hartley, you need to calm down. You're out of control. David kept his voice level, but his heart was pounding. He'd been in tense situations before, but never quite like this. Don't tell me to calm down. You come in here disrespecting everything I've worked for, everything I've sacrificed, and you tell me to calm down. David tried one more time to de-escalate. This is a courthouse. There are proper channels for disagreements. Let's both step back and... I don't need some know-it-all lawyer telling me what to do. The tension in the hallway had become almost unbearable. People were backing away, giving them space but still watching. David could see a security guard at the far end of the hall starting to move toward them, alerted by the commotion. And then it happened. In a moment that seemed to occur in slow motion, Hartley's control completely shattered. His right hand came up fast, and before David could even think to dodge, The officer's open palm connected with the side of his face with a sharp crack that echoed through the marble corridor. The slap was hard enough to snap David's head to the side. Pain exploded across his cheek and he tasted blood in his mouth where his teeth had cut the inside of his lip. For a second, the world seemed to freeze. The noise in the hallway cut off completely, replaced by a shocked silence. David stood perfectly still, his hand moving slowly to touch his burning cheek. He could feel eyes on him from every direction. His first instinct, his primal instinct, was to respond in kind. But years of discipline, years of training, years of learning to control his emotions in high-pressure situations kicked in. He looked directly at Hartley, who seemed almost as shocked by his own actions as everyone else. The officer's hand was still raised slightly as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. When David spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent hallway. "That was a mistake you're going to regret, Officer Hartley." He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't raise a hand. He simply stated a fact. The security guard who'd been approaching broke into a run. Within seconds, 2 guards had reached them. "Officer Hartley, step back now." But Hartley seemed unable to stop himself. Even as the guards moved between them, he kept shouting, "You deserve that. You and everyone like you need to learn some respect." The racist comments continued to pour out, each one more explicit than the last. The guards grabbed Hartley's arms, but he struggled against them, still trying to get at David. "I said step back." The lead security guard was a large man with a commanding presence, and he physically moved Hartley away from David, forcing him against the wall. "You need to calm down right now or you're going to be arrested." David stood in the hallway trying to process what had just happened, while people buzzed around him with concern and questions. His cheek throbbed with a dull, pulsing pain that seemed to intensify with each heartbeat. He could taste blood where his teeth had caught his lip, and he knew from experience that he'd have a nasty bruise by the end of the day. But more than the physical pain, David felt something else. A strange sense of calm. In that moment when Hartley had struck him, everything had crystallized. This wasn't just about Tommy's case anymore. This was about exposing a pattern of abuse and misconduct that had been allowed to continue for far too long. The older attorney who'd offered to be a witness stepped closer, his face etched with concern. "Son, are you sure you're okay? That was quite a hit. You should probably get checked out." "I appreciate your concern," David said, managing a small smile despite the pain. "But I'm fine. What I really need right now are statements from everyone who saw what happened." A young woman in a business suit pulled out a business card. "I'm an attorney with the firm down on 5th Street. I saw and heard everything." That officer completely lost control. The things he was saying. She shook her head in disgust. "I'll write up a detailed statement and send it to your office today." Others stepped forward with similar offers. The court clerk who'd been getting water, a paralegal who'd been waiting for her boss, even a defendant who'd been sitting on a bench waiting for his own hearing. They'd all witnessed Hartley's breakdown and wanted to help. David pulled out his phone and opened his notes app, wincing slightly as the movement made his cheek ache more. He quickly typed down names and contact information from each witness. His legal training was kicking into high gear now. Every detail mattered. Every statement would be crucial. Through all of this, Hartley remained restrained by the 2 security guards about 15 feet away. The officer had finally stopped struggling, but he still radiated anger. His face was red, his breathing heavy, and he kept muttering under his breath. Every few seconds, he'd glance at David with pure hatred in his eyes. David made sure to maintain his composure. He knew that how he handled this moment would matter. If he lost his temper, if he retaliated in any way, it could complicate everything. So he stood there, calm and professional, documenting everything while his face swelled and ached. The bailiff had rushed back into Judge Morrison's courtroom to inform her of what had transpired. David could only imagine how that conversation was going. Judge Morrison ran a tight ship in her courtroom, and she had zero tolerance for violence or intimidation, especially within the courthouse itself. Tommy emerged from the courtroom, his eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Chen, are you okay? Someone said Officer Hartley hit you." David placed a reassuring hand on his client's shoulder. "I'm fine, Tommy. Don't worry about me. This is actually going to help your case." "Help my case?" "But you're hurt." "Physical wounds heal," David said quietly. "But what just happened out here shows everyone who Officer Hartley really is. He couldn't control his temper in a courthouse surrounded by witnesses. The judge is going to see that the same lack of control is what led to your arrest that night. Tommy looked uncertain, but he nodded. His parents had pushed through the crowd and now stood beside their son, their faces a mixture of concern for David and fear about what this meant for their family. The lead security guard approached David. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us to file an official report. We'll also need to take photographs of your injury for evidence." "Of course," David replied. "But first I need to speak with Judge Morrison. She needs to understand the full context of what happened here." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened again, and the bailiff gestured for David to enter. "Judge Morrison wants to see you in chambers immediately. Officer Hartley as well." The security guards moved Hartley toward the courtroom. As they passed David, Hartley leaned in and hissed, "This isn't over." David met his eyes calmly. "Officer, I'd strongly suggest you stop talking. Anything you say right now is just making your situation worse." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Word of the hallway incident had spread, and everyone who'd remained inside was whispering and staring as David walked through. He kept his head up, his posture straight, refusing to show any weakness even though his face felt like it was on fire. Judge Morrison's chambers were behind the courtroom, accessed through a door near the bench. David had been back there once before for a conference on a different case. It was a surprisingly modest space, lined with law books and filled with the accumulated paperwork of decades on the bench. The judge was already seated behind her desk when David was shown in. Her face was set in hard lines, her eyes flashing with barely controlled anger. The prosecutor, Mr. Wilson, stood off to one side, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mr. Chen, please sit down," Judge Morrison said, her voice tight. "And let me see your face." David sat in one of the leather chairs across from her desk and turned his head so she could see the left side of his face where Hartley had struck him. He could tell from her sharp intake of breath that it looked as bad as it felt. "That's going to bruise significantly," she said. "Have you been seen by a medical professional?" "Not yet, Your Honor, but I will after we're done here." "See that you do." She leaned back in her chair, removing her glasses and pinching the bridge of her nose. "In 20 years on this bench, I have never had something like this happen during one of my hearings. Violence in the courthouse itself. It's unconscionable." "Your Honor, I want to be clear that I did nothing to provoke this attack," David said. "Officer Hartley approached me in the hallway during the recess. He was angry about how the hearing was going. I attempted to de-escalate the situation multiple times, but he became increasingly aggressive and eventually struck me. There are at least a dozen witnesses who saw and heard everything." Judge Morrison put her glasses back on. "The bailiff has already taken preliminary statements from some of those witnesses. They all corroborate your account. Officer Hartley apparently made several concerning statements during the confrontation." "Racist statements, Your Honor," David said bluntly. "He made it very clear that his actions toward me were motivated by prejudice. Just as his actions toward my client were motivated by prejudice." The judge nodded slowly. "I'm aware, and I find it deeply disturbing." She turned to look at the prosecutor. "Mr. Wilson, I'm going to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Did your office conduct any meaningful investigation before bringing charges against Mr. Richardson?" The prosecutor shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Your Honor, we relied on the officer's report and testimony, as we typically do in cases like this." "Cases like this," Judge Morrison repeated. "You mean cases where a police officer accuses someone of a crime? And it never occurred to anyone in your office to review the dashcam footage before charging a young man with assaulting an officer?" "Your Honor, with all due respect, we handle hundreds of cases." "That's not an answer, Mr. Wilson." Her voice had gone cold. "You brought serious charges against a college student, charges that could have destroyed his future without reviewing readily available video evidence. That's not just negligence. That's a failure of your duty to seek justice, not merely convictions." David had never heard Judge Morrison speak so forcefully to a prosecutor. He sat quietly, letting her words sink in. This was going even better than he'd hoped. There was a knock on the door and the bailiff entered with Officer Hartley, still flanked by the two security guards. Hartley's expression was sullen, his earlier rage seemingly burned out, replaced by a kind of stubborn defiance. Judge Morrison stood up, and everyone else in the room immediately stood as well out of respect. She looked directly at Hartley, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of her authority. Officer Hartley, I have been a judge for 2 decades. In that time, I have seen a lot of things, but I have never, in all my years on the bench, witnessed a display like what occurred in the hallway outside my courtroom today. Hartley opened his mouth to speak, but Judge Morrison held up her hand. You will not speak unless I ask you a direct question. Do you understand? Hartley's jaw clenched, but he nodded. I have statements from multiple witnesses indicating that you assaulted Mr. Chen without provocation, that you made threatening statements toward him, and that you directed racist comments at him during your confrontation. Is any of that incorrect? Hartley remained silent for a moment, then muttered, He was trying to destroy my career. I didn't ask for your justification, officer. I asked if the description of your actions was incorrect. Yes or no? He provoked me. Yes or no, Officer Hartley? The officer looked down at the floor. No, Your Honor, that's what happened. Then let me be absolutely clear about what happens next, Judge Morrison said. You will be charged with assault and battery. Given the nature of your statements, hate crime enhancements will likely apply. You will face disciplinary action from your department, and I am personally going to request that the State Attorney General investigate how someone with your record has been allowed to continue serving as a police officer. Hartley's head snapped up. You can't do that. I have rights. You absolutely have rights, officer. The next morning, David woke up to find his face had swollen even more overnight. The left side was puffy and discolored, a vivid purple bruise spreading from his cheekbone down to his jaw. He stared at himself in the bathroom mirror, gently touching the tender skin and wincing at the sharp pain that followed. His phone had been ringing nonstop since yesterday afternoon. News of the courthouse assault had spread like wildfire through the legal community and beyond. Local television stations wanted interviews. Newspapers wanted statements. Other attorneys who'd had run-ins with Officer Hartley were reaching out, sharing their own stories of the officer's misconduct. David had spent most of the previous evening at an urgent care clinic, getting his face examined and photographed for evidence. The doctor had confirmed what he already suspected. No broken bones, just significant bruising and soft tissue damage that would take a couple of weeks to fully heal. But the photographs would be crucial evidence in the criminal case against Hartley. Now, as he got ready for what he knew would be a significant day in court, David thought about everything that had transpired. In his 15 years of practicing law, he'd faced angry clients, hostile opposing counsel, and difficult judges. But he'd never been physically assaulted in a courthouse. The violation of that space, a place where conflicts were supposed to be resolved through words and reason rather than violence, made what Hartley had done even worse. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Judge Morrison has called an emergency hearing for 10 a.m. She wants you there. Media already gathering outside courthouse. David texted back a quick confirmation and finished getting dressed. He chose a dark blue suit and a burgundy tie, the same professional attire he always wore to court. The bruise on his face would speak for itself. He didn't need to do anything to draw attention to it. When David arrived at the courthouse at 9:30, he was shocked by what he saw. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes extended toward the sky. Reporters stood in clusters, checking their equipment and reviewing their notes. A crowd of people had gathered on the courthouse steps, some holding signs that read, "Justice for all" and "No more bad cops." As David made his way through the crowd, several reporters recognized him and rushed forward with microphones extended. Questions came at him from all directions. Mr. Chen, how are you feeling after the assault? Do you think this incident represents a larger problem in the police department? Will you be filing a civil lawsuit against Officer Hartley? David paused at the top of the steps, turning to face the cameras. He'd prepared a brief statement knowing this moment would come. Yesterday, I was assaulted by Officer Hartley while performing my duties as an attorney. But this isn't about me. This is about a pattern of misconduct that has gone unchecked for too long. It's about my client, Tommy Richardson, who was falsely charged with a crime he didn't commit. And it's about countless others who may have suffered at the hands of an officer who should never have been allowed to continue serving. Thank you. He walked inside before they could ask follow-up questions. The courthouse lobby was buzzing with activity. David recognized several prominent attorneys, community activists, and even a city councilwoman among the crowd. This case had clearly struck a nerve with people who'd been concerned about police accountability for years. Security was tighter than usual. Extra guards stood at the metal detectors, and David noticed several police supervisors he didn't recognize standing in the hallway, their faces grim. This wasn't just another hearing. This was something bigger. Tommy and his family were already inside, seated on a bench near Judge Morrison's courtroom. The young man stood when he saw David, his eyes immediately going to the bruise on his attorney's face. "Mr. Chen, you look—" Tommy trailed off, unsure what to say. "Like I got hit by an angry police officer?" David smiled gently. "Don't worry about me, Tommy. How are you holding up?" "I barely slept last night," Tommy admitted. "I keep thinking about what happened. If he did that to you, in a courthouse with witnesses everywhere, what would he have done to me on that dark street if there hadn't been a camera?" It was a sobering thought, and one that David had considered himself. "That's exactly why we're here today, to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." At precisely 10 o'clock, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Morrison." The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled, and people stood along the back wall. David recognized several reporters with notebooks, community leaders, and other attorneys who'd come to witness what everyone sensed would be a historic moment. Judge Morrison entered and took her seat, her expression serious and determined. She looked out over the crowded courtroom, and David could see her taking in the magnitude of what was happening. This wasn't just about one case anymore. This was about accountability and justice on a systemic level. "Please be seated," she said, and the room settled into an expectant silence. "I've called this hearing because what happened yesterday in the hallway outside this courtroom cannot be ignored or minimized. An officer of the law assaulted an attorney who was representing his client. This is not just a criminal matter. It represents a fundamental breakdown in the integrity that we expect from those who serve in law enforcement." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've spent the last 18 hours reviewing materials related to Officer Derek Hartley's career. What I've discovered is deeply disturbing, and it demands immediate action." Judge Morrison gestured to her clerk, who brought forward a large stack of files. "These are the complaint records for Officer Hartley covering his 15-year career. Mr. Chen presented some of this information yesterday, but I've now obtained the complete files from the police department." She opened the first folder. The first complaint against Officer Hartley was filed in his second year on the force. A man named Robert Jenkins alleged that Officer Hartley used excessive force during a traffic stop and made racially charged statements. The complaint was investigated by Internal Affairs and determined to be unfounded. Judge Morrison set that file aside and picked up another. 6 months later, another complaint. A woman named Patricia Gomez alleged that Officer Hartley pulled her over without cause, searched her vehicle without permission, and threatened her when she asked to speak to a supervisor. Again, the complaint was investigated and dismissed. She continued through file after file, each one telling a similar story. Citizens alleging misconduct. Internal Affairs investigating but finding no wrongdoing. Officer Hartley continuing to serve without any meaningful consequences. "By my count," Judge Morrison said, her voice growing harder with each word, "Officer Hartley has been the subject of 23 complaints over 15 years. 23 separate incidents where citizens felt compelled to formally report his conduct. And in every single case, the complaint was either dismissed or resulted in nothing more than a written warning." The courtroom was absolutely silent. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Judge Morrison looked up from the files. "What makes this even more troubling is the pattern. 18 of those 23 complaints involved people of color. The allegations consistently describe unnecessarily aggressive behavior, use of excessive force, and discriminatory language. This is not random. This is a pattern." She turned her attention to a section of the courtroom where several police officials were seated. "I want answers as to how this was allowed to continue. How does an officer accumulate 23 complaints without any meaningful discipline? How does an officer with this record continue to patrol our streets, interact with our citizens, and represent our justice system?" One of the officials, a deputy chief whose nameplate identified him as Deputy Chief Anderson, stood up. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" "Please do, Deputy Chief." Anderson cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "Your Honor, I've only been in my current position for 2 years, so I wasn't involved in most of these complaint investigations. However, I've begun reviewing them this morning, and I share your concerns. The internal affairs process appears to have failed in this case." "Failed?" Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. Deputy Chief, this wasn't a failure. This was a systematic dismissal of legitimate concerns raised by members of our community. Each of these complaints was investigated, which means someone looked at the evidence and chose to dismiss it. That's not failure. That's a choice, Anderson nodded slowly. You're correct, Your Honor, and I assure you that we're taking this very seriously. We've already initiated a comprehensive review of our complaint procedures. That's a start, Judge Morrison said. But it's not enough. I'm formally requesting that the State Attorney General conduct an independent investigation into the police department's internal affairs process. I want to know why these complaints were dismissed, who made those decisions, and whether there are other officers with similar patterns of misconduct that have been ignored. She picked up another file. I'm also ordering a review of every case that Officer Hartley has been involved with over the past 15 years. Every arrest he made, every report he filed, every piece of testimony he gave. If he was willing to falsify evidence in Mr. Richardson's case. 3 days after Judge Morrison's powerful hearing, David sat in his office surrounded by files, documents, and his laptop displaying page after page of case notes. What had started as a single case defending Tommy Richardson had evolved into something much larger. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the judge's public statements about Officer Hartley's record. His assistant, Linda, knocked on the door and peeked in. David, there's another one, Mr. William Foster. He says Officer Hartley arrested him 4 years ago on drug charges. He's been out of prison for 6 months and heard about what happened. He wants to talk. David rubbed his tired eyes. This was the 8th person to call in 3 days. 8 different people, all claiming they'd been falsely arrested or mistreated by the same officer. Tell him I'll call him back within the hour. Get his contact information and a brief summary of his case. As Linda left, David stood up and walked to the window of his small office. The city stretched out before him. Thousands of people going about their daily lives, most of them trusting that the police were there to protect and serve. But how many others had been victims of Officer Hartley's misconduct? How many had accepted plea deals because they didn't think anyone would believe them over a police officer? His desk was covered with records he'd been reviewing. The State Attorney General had moved quickly, impressed by Judge Morrison's forceful statements. Within 48 hours of the hearing, they'd opened a formal investigation into both Officer Hartley and the police department's internal affairs process. They'd also granted David access to certain records as part of his civil lawsuit preparation. What David had found was staggering. He picked up one file folder, this one belonging to a man named Andre Williams, who'd been arrested by Hartley 3 years ago. According to the arrest report, Williams had been pulled over for a broken taillight. Hartley claimed he smelled substances in the vehicle and conducted a search, finding a small amount of illegal material in the glove compartment. Williams had insisted the substances weren't his, that Hartley had planted it, but no one believed him. He'd taken a plea deal to avoid trial and spent 18 months in prison. But now, with everything that was coming to light about Hartley, David wondered. Had Andre Williams been telling the truth? Had Hartley planted evidence? Another file caught his attention. This one involved a woman named Christina Martinez. She'd been arrested after Hartley responded to a domestic dispute call at her apartment. Hartley's report claimed Martinez had assaulted her partner and resisted arrest, requiring him to use force to subdue her. But Martinez's medical records told a different story. She'd been treated for a broken wrist, bruised ribs, and facial injuries. The emergency room doctor had noted that her injuries seemed excessive for the situation described in the police report. The internal affairs investigation had cleared Hartley, accepting his explanation that Martinez had been violent and combative. But no one had bothered to interview the neighbors who'd witnessed the arrest. David had tracked down 2 of them. Both said Martinez had been calm and cooperative when Hartley arrived. They described watching in horror as the officer became increasingly aggressive for no apparent reason. David's phone rang. It was the district attorney's office. Mr. Chen, this is Assistant District Attorney Rachel Kim. I'm calling about the Hartley cases. David sat up straighter. Yes, Ms. Kim, what can I do for you? It's more about what I can do for you, she replied, her voice grim. My office has been reviewing every case that Hartley was involved with, as Judge Morrison ordered. We've found problems. Serious problems. How serious? We've identified at least 15 cases over the past 10 years where Hartley's testimony was the primary evidence against the defendant. In several of these cases, his reports contain inconsistencies or claims that can't be verified. We're starting to believe that some of these convictions may be unsound. David felt his heart rate increase. This was even bigger than he'd thought. 15 cases? That's 15 people whose lives may have been destroyed because of one officer's lies. Exactly, Kim said. And that's just what we found in our initial review. There could be more. The Attorney General's office is coordinating with us, and we're planning to file motions to vacate several of these convictions. We'll be reaching out to the defendants or their families to inform them. Ms. Kim, I've had 8 people contact me in the last 3 days, all claiming Hartley mistreated them or falsely arrested them. I can send you their information. Please do. We need to cast a wide net here. Every case Hartley touched is now suspect. After hanging up with the prosecutor, David sat back in his chair trying to process the magnitude of what was unfolding. 15 wrongful convictions, maybe more. 15 people who'd lost years of their lives. Who'd lost jobs, relationships, their reputations, all because one officer had been allowed to operate without oversight for 15 years. His computer dinged with a new email. It was from an investigator with the Attorney General's office, forwarding him copies of Officer Hartley's internal affairs investigation files. David had requested these as part of his civil lawsuit discovery, and the court had ordered them to be produced. He opened the first file and began reading. It was the investigation into the very first complaint against Hartley, the one filed by Robert Jenkins 15 years ago. Jenkins had alleged that Hartley pulled him over without cause, used excessive force during the traffic stop, and made racist comments. The internal affairs investigation had consisted of an interview with Hartley, an interview with Jenkins, and a review of Hartley's report. The investigating officer had concluded that Jenkins's allegations were not credible, based primarily on the fact that Hartley denied them and had no history of similar complaints. David shook his head in frustration. Of course, Hartley had no history at that point. It was his first complaint, and the investigator had simply taken Hartley's word over Jenkins with no additional evidence. He moved to the next file. This complaint was from 2 years later, filed by a teenager named Marcus Johnson. Johnson alleged that Hartley had stopped him while he was walking home from school, searched his backpack without permission, and then arrested him for having a small pocket knife that was actually legal to carry under state law. The charges were eventually dismissed, but Johnson's complaint about Hartley's conduct remained. The internal affairs investigation for this complaint was even more cursory. The investigator had interviewed Hartley, who claimed Johnson was acting suspicious and that the search was justified. The investigator never interviewed Johnson himself, never looked at the actual laws regarding knife possession, and concluded the complaint was unfounded. File after file revealed the same pattern. Complaints would come in, describing problematic behavior by Hartley. The internal affairs investigations would be superficial at best, almost always siding with the officer over the complainant. No one seemed to notice or care that the same officer kept generating complaints year after year. David found one file particularly troubling. It was from 7 years ago, and it involved a formal complaint from another police officer. Officer Janet Reeves had filed an internal complaint alleging that Hartley had used racial slurs in the locker room and had bragged about teaching punks a key lesson during arrests. This should have been taken seriously. This was a fellow officer raising concerns about Hartley's conduct and attitudes. But the investigation had been closed quickly with a notation that it was a personality conflict between officers, and both parties had been counseled about maintaining professional relationships. David picked up his phone and called the investigator at the Attorney General's office. I'm looking at these internal affairs files you sent over. Have you seen the complaint from Officer Reeves? Yes, we saw that one. We're trying to locate Officer Reeves now. She left the department about 5 years ago. Any idea why she left? Not yet, but we're going to find out. It's possible she faced retaliation for making that complaint. It happens more often than people think. After ending that call, David spent the next several hours diving deeper into the files. He created a timeline, mapping out every complaint against Hartley, every internal investigation, and every case where Hartley had made arrests. Patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore. Hartley's arrests disproportionately involved people of color, particularly in neighborhoods where he seemed to patrol more frequently. His use of force reports were significantly higher than other officers with similar tenure. And the complaints against him spiked during certain periods, particularly after he'd been passed over for promotion or after he'd received any form of criticism from supervisors. It painted a picture of an officer who was angry, racially biased, and willing to abuse his authority to take out his frustrations on vulnerable people who he thought couldn't fight back. David's assistant knocked again. "David, I hate to interrupt, but there's someone here to see you. She says it's important." "Her name is Janet Reeves." David's eyes widened. The former officer who'd filed the complaint about Hartley. "Send her in immediately." A woman in her early 40s entered the office. She wore jeans and a casual jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked nervous but determined. The week following David's meeting with Janet Reeves felt like a whirlwind. News of the expanding investigation into Officer Hartley dominated local media. Every evening, news broadcasts featured interviews with people who claimed they'd been mistreated by the officer. Social media buzzed with discussions about police accountability and systemic reform. The story had touched a nerve in the community, bringing to the surface years of frustration and mistrust. David had barely slept. His office had been flooded with calls from potential victims, from other attorneys wanting to coordinate efforts, from reporters seeking comments, and from community organizations offering support. He'd hired 2 paralegals just to help manage the incoming cases and organize the mountain of evidence that continued to grow. The criminal case against Hartley was proceeding quickly. The district attorney's office, eager to show they were taking the matter seriously, had prioritized the prosecution. Hartley had been arrested and charged with assault and battery, with hate crime enhancements added based on his documented statements during the courthouse incident. He'd posted bail but was on administrative leave from the police department, effectively suspended without pay, pending the outcome of both the criminal case and the internal investigation. Now, David stood outside Judge Morrison's courtroom once again, waiting for what everyone expected to be a pivotal hearing. The judge had received the preliminary report from the Attorney General's investigation, and she'd called this session to address the findings publicly. The hallway was even more crowded than it had been the previous week. David recognized several of the people who'd contacted him about their own experiences with Hartley. Tommy Richardson was there with his parents, offering moral support. Janet Reeves stood near the back looking nervous but resolute. And scattered throughout the crowd were reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens who'd come to witness what they hoped would be a moment of accountability. David's bruise had faded to a yellowish-green color that he could mostly cover with makeup, but it was still visible if you looked closely. He'd considered that perhaps the fading bruise was symbolic. The physical wound was healing, but the work of healing the systemic wounds would take much longer. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors and everyone filed in. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. This wasn't just another hearing. This felt like a turning point. Judge Morrison took the bench promptly at 10 o'clock. She surveyed the packed courtroom with her characteristic, calm authority before speaking. "We're here today to address the findings of the Attorney General's preliminary investigation into Officer Derek Hartley and the police department's internal affairs process. I've asked the lead investigator, Special Agent Michelle Torres, to present her findings to this court." A woman in her 50s stood up from the front row. She wore a professional gray suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. She approached the podium set up in front of the judge's bench. "Your Honor, thank you for this opportunity. Over the past week, my team has conducted an extensive review of Officer Hartley's career, the complaints filed against him, and the internal investigations that followed. What we've discovered is deeply troubling and requires immediate action." Special Agent Torres pulled out a tablet and referred to her notes as she spoke. Officer Hartley's career spans 15 years. During that time, he was the subject of 23 formal complaints. Our investigation has revealed that every single one of these complaints was dismissed or minimally addressed by the Internal Affairs Division. But more importantly, we've discovered why. She paused for effect. We found evidence that certain supervisors within the department actively worked to protect Officer Hartley from consequences. These supervisors would influence internal affairs investigations, encourage complainants to withdraw their complaints, and in some cases, alter reports to make Hartley's actions seem more justified than they actually were. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Morrison raised her hand for silence. Continue, Special Agent Torres. We've identified 3 supervisors who appear to have been particularly involved in protecting Officer Hartley. All 3 have been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. We're also looking into whether their actions constitute criminal obstruction of justice. David leaned forward in his seat. This was exactly what they'd hoped to find. Evidence that Hartley's misconduct wasn't just individual failure, but was enabled by corruption within the department itself. Special Agent Torres continued. Additionally, we've reviewed the 15 cases that the District Attorney's Office identified as potentially problematic. In 11 of those 15 cases, we've found clear evidence of falsified reports, planted evidence, or perjured testimony by Officer Hartley. We're recommending that all 11 convictions be vacated immediately. The courtroom erupted in gasps and whispered conversations. Judge Morrison didn't call for order this time, allowing people a moment to process this shocking information. 11 wrongful convictions, Torres repeated. 11 people who lost years of their lives because Officer Hartley fabricated evidence and lied under oath. And this is just what we've found in our preliminary investigation. We believe there may be more cases that haven't yet been identified. She looked directly at Judge Morrison. Your Honor, in my 25 years with the Attorney General's office, I've investigated corrupt officers before. But I've never seen a case where the systemic failure was this extensive. Officer Hartley should have been stopped after his first or second complaint. Instead, he was protected and enabled for 15 years. The damage he was allowed to inflict on this community is incalculable. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Special Agent Torres, what are your recommendations moving forward? We recommend a complete overhaul of the police department's complaint and disciplinary procedures. We recommend criminal charges against the supervisors who protected Officer Hartley. We recommend that every case he was involved with be reviewed, even those that haven't been flagged as problematic. And we recommend federal oversight of the department until meaningful reforms are implemented and verified. The judge turned to the section where the police officials were seated. Deputy Chief Anderson, do you have a response to these findings? Deputy Chief Anderson stood up, his face grave. Your Honor, the department is committed to cooperating fully with this investigation. We've already begun implementing some reforms. All complaint investigations will now be handled by an independent civilian review board. We're requiring all officers to undergo additional training on proper use of force and recognizing bias, and we're conducting a full audit of our Internal Affairs Division to identify any other cases where investigations may have been compromised. That's a good start, Judge Morrison said, but it's not enough. The Attorney General's recommendation for federal oversight seems appropriate, given the severity of these findings. She picked up a document from her desk. I'm issuing an order today requiring the District Attorney's Office to immediately begin the process of vacating the 11 wrongful convictions that have been identified. The defendants in those cases, or their families if they've passed away, should be notified immediately and offered appropriate compensation. Judge Morrison looked out at the crowded courtroom. I'm also ordering that the police department provide a public accounting of how many people were arrested by Officer Hartley over his 15-year career. Every single one of those people deserves to know that the officer who arrested them has been exposed as corrupt. Some of them may have valid claims that haven't yet been identified. She turned her attention to Tommy Richardson, who was sitting in the front row. Mr. Richardson, would you please stand? Tommy stood up, looking nervous. Mr. Richardson, you were brave enough to fight false charges even when the odds seemed stacked against you. Because of your courage and because of your attorney's dedication, a corrupt officer has been exposed and many other victims will now receive justice. This court and this community owe you a debt of gratitude. Tommy's eyes filled with tears. His mother reached over and squeezed his hand. Judge Morrison continued addressing the courtroom. This case has revealed painful truths about our justice system, but it has also shown us that accountability is possible when people have the courage to stand up for what's right. Mr. Chen was assaulted for doing his job, for defending his client, and he could have simply pressed charges and moved on. Instead, he used that moment to shine a light on a much larger problem. That's what justice looks like. She looked at David directly. Mr. Chen, I know you've been working around the clock on this case. I know you've been helping other victims come forward and coordinating with the Attorney General's office. The legal community and this community at large are fortunate to have an attorney of your caliber and integrity. David felt his face grow warm with the unexpected praise. He simply nodded respectfully at the judge. Now, Judge Morrison's tone became more formal. Let's discuss Officer Hartley's criminal case. I understand he's pleading not guilty to the assault charges? The prosecutor stood up. Yes, Your Honor. Officer Hartley has entered a not guilty plea and is requesting a jury trial. 3 months later, David sat in the same courthouse where everything had started. But this time the atmosphere was completely different. The media circus had calmed down, though several reporters still attended every hearing related to the Hartley case. What had begun as a shocking incident had evolved into a comprehensive examination of police accountability and systemic reform. Today was Officer Derek Hartley's sentencing hearing. He'd been convicted 2 weeks earlier on all counts, assault and battery with hate crime enhancements. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict. The evidence had been overwhelming, and Hartley's own attorney had privately admitted to David that his client had made the case impossible to defend. The courtroom was full, but not packed like it had been during the earlier hearings. Those present were mostly people directly affected by Hartley's actions, his victims, their families, and a handful of reporters documenting what would likely be the final chapter in this particular story.